Welcome students. I hope you are all keeping well and staying safe at home. So let's continue with the chapter 2, self and personality. So today we are going to cover the last topic of this chapter, that is behavioral analysis. So today under this we will try to cover various techniques which come under this behavioral analysis. So let us continue. So under the topic behavioral analysis, we will try to understand the various technique for assessing behavior. One is interview, then observation, then rating, nomination, and last one is situational test. So let's try to understand these techniques in details. So the first technique of behavioral analysis is interview. So the procedure for interview is different from that for the questionnaire. Both have the same aim and is to obtain data regarding the respondents with minimum bias and maximum efficiency. So basically, interview is a face-to-face situation between the interviewer and the respondents, which intends to elicit some desired information from the latter. So thus an interview is a social process involving at least two persons, the interviewer and the respondent. So for success of the interview, one must take care of the interaction between the interviewer and the respondent. The respondent's answer to the question raised by the interviewer and his other behavior serve as important clues to the interviewer and are likely to affect the behavior of the. So there are two types of interview, namely formal interview and informal interview. A formal interview may be defined as one in which already prepared questions are asked in a set order by the interviewer and answers are recorded in a standardized form. So the formal interview is gaining much popularity today. The investigator aims at having interviews conducted in a uniform way. So the formal interview is also known as a structured or patterned interview. Thus, the formal interview is a systematic procedure for collecting information regarding the respondents, and therefore it is not surprising that the reported validities for formal interviews are usually higher than those for the informal interviews. As the interview situation is highly structured, that is that then those for the informal interviews, as the interview situation is highly structured, that is the questions, their sequence and scoring methods are all predetermined. Relatively less trained interviewers can also conduct such an interview smoothly. Next type is an informal interview. So an informal interview is one where there are no predetermined questions, nor is there any preset order of questions, or it is left to the interviewer to ask some questions in a way he likes regarding a number of key points around which the interview is to be built up. And as most things depend upon the interviewer, the situation remains unstructured, and therefore such an interview is also known as unstructured interview. An informal interview is more commonly used than the formal interview and is a flexible method of collecting data. So the primary advantage of the informal interview over the formal interview is that in the former, the interviewer can dig deeper and thus get a deeper understanding of the respondent's behavior. So the next technique of behavioral analysis is observation. So now in behavioral researches, questionnaires and interviews are very common and important types of data collecting devices. But There are situations in which these devices can't be used meaningfully. For example, when the investigator wants to see the behavioral behavior in natural situation and study the situation-based features of conduct, the questionnaire and the interviews no more serves the purpose, and some form of observation becomes very important. So observation as a fundamental technique of data collection refers to watching and listening to the behavior of other persons over time with manipulating and controlling it, and records findings in a way that allows some degree of analytical interpretations and discussion. So thus, observation involves broadly selecting, recording, and encoding behavior for empirical aims of description. So now, there are various purposes of observation. So one major purpose of observation is to capture and study human behavior as it actually happens. So another purpose of observation is to provide a description of a real life that can be acquired in other ways. So there are so many areas of life about which we have few thorough descriptions, and much is taken granted about those areas by social scientists. For example, how does a delinquent steal a motorcycle? How does a person actually go about learning to be an engineer or doctor? So So the descriptive base for all such life events is often provided only by observation. So another method of observation is exploration. So when the investigators observe human behavior in a real life settings, he gets a good chance to explore those variables which were important but overlooked. So he also develops a tendency to look beyond what is already known about the subject and to examine the probability of some alternative direction for research. So not only that, observation also aims at correcting some methodological errors which others otherwise might have been overlooked. So still, the interview and the observation method is not without limitations or problems. Its major disadvantages are like professional training is required. So how to record information, how to jot down the main comments and points. So for all these a professional training is required, because these methods are different from because layman observation is different from the scientific observation, so obviously a professional training is required. So the next is, these methods are quite demanding and time consuming. Yes, of course, the interview and observation takes much time in completion, because each respondent or the interviewee is interviewed individually, and the record of the verbal interaction of each respondent is kept individually. So sometimes tapes are used for recording the proceeding of the interview, for curtailing the time taken unnecessarily in recording by the interviews, but even then additional time is taken to transcribe information from tapes. Next is uh, mere presence of the observer may contaminate the results. So yes, of course, as a stranger, the observer may influence the behavior of the person being observed, and he or she may get conscious about his or her behavior and may behave in a very social desirable manner, and thus not obtain good data. Next technique of behavioral analysis is behavioral ratings. So behavioral ratings are relatively new ones, and through them the performance evaluation in a job or a profession is measured on the possible dimensions. The dimension can be, for example, the academic performance of a college is to be evaluated, and a group of experts consisting of students and teachers decides the dimensions to be important and appropriate ones, like sincerity of the students, observational ability of the teachers, organizational ability of the teachers, and appropriate syllabus. These are the dimensions on which performance of the students is being, or the teachers being evaluated. So behavioral rating scales have some advantages and disadvantages. So the first disadvantage of the behavioral rating is halo effect. So halo effect is when one good quality of a person is used to make a good generalization about that person with no basis. For example, if you think that if somebody is nice, or if you think in terms he is very nice, may impact your evaluation of that person's specific trait, he is also smart. So that means the tendency of an impression created in one area to influence opinion in another area. So the next is middle category bias. It means it is the tendency of an individual to mark the dimensions only in the middle of the scale by avoiding the end position or the extreme position. So the next is extreme response bias. It's the opposite of middle category bias, in which the tendency of an individual to mark the dimensions at the end position in the extreme position, thus by avoiding middle categories on the scale. Next technique of behavioral analysis is nomination. So a nominating technique is a technique in which each person names or nominates another person's events, objects, subject matters which are perceived as fitting into certain categories or situation. So the technique is mostly applied for starting social choices and rejections. So sociometry is one type of nominating technique which is used in the study of group structure, social status, and personality traits. Thus, it is a technique of evaluating interpersonal relationships in a group. So the next type of behavioral analysis is situational test. So a variety of situational tests have been devised for the assessment of personality. The most commonly used test of this kind is the situational stress test. It provides us with information about how a person behaves under stressful situations. So the test requires a person to perform a given task with other persons who are instructed to be non-cooperative and interfering. So the test involves a kind of role playing. The person is instructed to play a role for which he or she is observed. A verbal report is also obtained on what he or she was asked to do. The situation may be a realistic one, or it may be created through a video play.